A tiger roars through the shattered streets of Berlin, its massive engine growling over the crack of small arms fire and the shriek of rocket-propelled grenades. The date is May 2nd, 1945, and the last armored monsters of the Third Reich are consumed in the smoke and flame of their own funeral pyre, their final breakout attempt collapsing under a squall of Soviet fire near the Wedendammer Bridge. The tank's commander, his uniform black, with soot and reeking of cordite, squints through a cracked vision block, an apocalyptic landscape of burning vehicles and crumbling facades searing into his memory. He is one of the elite, a survivor of a 1,000-yard stare forged in the fire of 4 long years of war, a soldier who has ridden these steel beasts from the snows of Kharkov to the desperate fields of Hungary, and now he is witness to the very end of his world. This is the final, brutal chapter of a story that began not with defeat, but with the audacious promise of absolute technological supremacy. It is the story of the Tiger tank, a 60-ton predator born in the chaos of a collapsing Eastern Front, a weapon that would create some of history's most legendary tank aces, only to be consumed by the fiery cataclysm of a war it could never hope to win. To understand the scale of this final immolation, we must travel back to where it all began, to the waning months of 1942, when the very idea of a heavy breakthrough tank was little more than a blueprint on a draftsman's table and a desperate gamble whispered in the corridors of power. On the 15th of November 1942, a terse order from the German High Command ripples through the military bureaucracy, an order setting in motion the creation of the first independent heavy Tiger companies. At training grounds across Germany, places like Fallingbostel and Sennelager, a revolutionary weapons system is about to take tangible form, a machine designed not just to fight on the battlefield, but to dominate it entirely with an unheard-of combination of armor and firepower. For the men of the Waffen-SS and the elite army division Großdeutschland, this is no ordinary assignment. These formations, favored by the Reich for their political reliability and aggressive spirit, are to be the first to receive this radical new tank. They are not simply getting a new piece of equipment. They are being entrusted with a weapon deemed so powerful it could, in theory, shatter an enemy armored assault with a single well-placed shot, and do so from a standoff distance, far beyond the range of any riposte. One of the young officers watching these first angular steel forms take shape is a tall, unassuming tank commander from the 1st SS Panzer Division, a man named Michael Wittmann. Like his comrades, he is captivated by the sheer scale of the Tiger, so different from the Panzer IIIs and IVs they had been used to, a machine that seems to squat on the frozen earth with a lethal, predatory stillness. Its long 88mm cannon, looking less like a gun barrel and more like a bolt of thunder forged into steel. But the war, as it always does, refuses to wait for perfection. By early February 1943, the nascent companies are rushed east, their tanks still fresh with factory paint, their crews only half-trained on the complex, temperamental mechanical beast beneath them. They detrain in Poltava and Kharkov, stepping not into a parade ground, but directly into a maelstrom, the entire German southern flank in a state of collapse after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. Their first battle is not a textbook assault on a prepared line, but a desperate, freezing counteroffensive against a surging Red Army. The operational readiness reports are stark. On 26 February 1943, a single company like the 13th Heavy Company of the Großdeutschland Division could muster only 4 runners out of its paper strength of 9. Around them, the front convulses. A battalion commander, Oberst Graf Strachwitz, rallies a quick-reaction Kampfgruppe, throwing the handful of available Tigers into the breach with an almost reckless urgency, demanding they plug a gap threatening to unravel the entire sector. It is in these swirling, uncoordinated skirmishes on the road to Kharkov that the lethal profile of the Tiger is first truly revealed. On the 7th of March, the 13th Company's Tigers, part of Kampfgruppe Strachwitz, crash headlong into Soviet tank formations near the town of Komtakusovo. The clash is brutal and intimate, a brawl in blinding snowdrifts where visibility is measured in meters, and accuracy is less a matter of gun sights than of nerve and instinct. The 88mm cannon speaks with a flat, percussive crack, unlike the higher-pitched bark of the smaller German guns. From ranges where Soviet 76mm shells simply bounce off the Tiger's frontal armor, the German rounds punch cleanly through T-34 hulls, often setting them ablaze with a single shot. The Tigers are not merely winning these engagements, they are dismantling entire armored spearheads with a chilling, methodical efficiency that leaves the survivors utterly demoralized. The tank commander, representing the new generation of aces, Heinz Kling, leads from the front with a cold, professional fury. He is not a wild gambler but a master of the intricate ballet of armored warfare, using his radio net to coordinate fire, exploiting every fold in the terrain. Time and again his iron discipline acts as a rock against which the Red Army wave breaks and crumbles. His Tigers becoming the pivot around which entire defensive actions turn. The resilience of this untested steel is just as shocking as its firepower. On numerous occasions, a single Tiger, immobilized either by mechanical failure or a lucky track hit, acts as an unassailable steel fortress. Its commander, often a veteran non-commissioned officer, would simply refuse to retreat, transforming his wounded vehicle into a defiant strongpoint, methodically engaging and destroying any Soviet armor foolish enough to approach, his tank absorbing dozens of non-penetrating hits until the armor-piercing ammunition in its hull bins was nearly exhausted. The crew deafened by the incessant clang of deflected shells but still fighting. By the time German infantry of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps closes the steel trap on Kharkov in mid-March, the legend of the Tiger is fully formed. The city, which had been a symbol of catastrophic German retreat just weeks earlier, is once again in German hands, and the Tiger companies, though shot to pieces by this first brutal winter campaign, have more than proven their worth. From his own heavily scarred Tiger, a young platoon leader named Helmut Wendorf emerges, a man who would later knock out 11 T-34s in a single running engagement near Chubarovka. He is a product of this new era of aces, men who grew not from the sweeping blitzkrieg maneuvers of 1941, but from the gritty, desperate, and unbelievably lethal close-quarters brawls of the winter defensive battles. The war diary for the 13th Heavy Company of the SS Leibstandarte is a grim ledger of what this baptism of fire costs in blood and steel. In less than 3 months of fighting, totaling barely a dozen days of actual full-scale combat, the small unit destroys a staggering tally of 343 enemy tanks and 255 anti-tank guns. The price for this alchemy of destruction is their own near-total annihilation, with almost all their original tanks lost to relentless combat or mechanical collapse. The men pause in a shattered vehicle park near Poltava, replacing track links and patching armor with welding torches, their breath misting in the crisp late March air. Michael Whitman, his face etched with fatigue, stands beside his Panzer. The first taste of victory is laced with the metallic scent of burned powder and diesel, a foreboding taste of the sheer scale of what would be required to stave off the coming year's onslaught. A silent and grim realization settling over the veterans like the endless Russian snow. The mud of the spring thaw had barely dried in the training fields west of Kharkov when the Tiger companies began their transformation. Throughout April and May of 1943, the battered units that had clawed their way through the winter counteroffensive were rebuilt and reorganized. New tanks arrived on flat cars, their factory-fresh dark yellow paint still smelling of solvents. The old Panzer IIIs that had once accompanied the Tigers were handed over to other units. The heavy companies would now fight pure, 14 tanks each, organized into 3 platoons with a headquarters section of 2 command vehicles. The reorganization brought new faces and new equipment. In the 13th Heavy Company of the SS Leibstandarte, Heinz Kling received 5 replacement Tigers in mid-May, their turret sides still bare of camouflage. His gunner, a taciturn veteran of the winter battles, supervised the bore sighting of the 88mm cannon as the crews applied the new curved brown lines over the yellow-olive base coat. The Panzer IIIs, those reliable workhorses that had screened the Tigers from infantry assaults at Warki and Byelgorod, were driven away to the regiment's lighter battalions, their departure marking the end of the mixed platoon era. For Helmut Wendorf, the young platoon leader whose gun barrel had been hot from knocking out 11 T-34s in a single engagement, the rest period was an opportunity to train replacements. 40 Luftwaffe airmen, transferred from a collapsing air force that could no longer put machines in the sky, arrived at the company bivouac in early May. Wendorf drilled them relentlessly on the loader's sequence. Grab the 88mm round from the ready rack, slam it into the breech, step clear, repeat. The former flyers wore the black Panzer uniform awkwardly, their movements stiff and mechanical, but by late May they were loading in under 7 seconds. The Großdeutschland Tigers, meanwhile, were undergoing an even more radical expansion. The 13th Heavy Company, which had fought with only 9 tanks at Kharkov, was now being absorbed into an entirely new battalion. In the Senelaga training area, far to the west, the 3rd Battalion of Panzer Regiment Großdeutschland was forming around a corps of veterans. Major Go Mill, the new battalion commander, watched as factory-fresh Tigers rolled off the trains. Their engines, the new HL-230P45 models. Their turret sides awaiting the unique letter prefix markings that would designate them as A, B, or C company vehicles. But the war refused to grant unlimited preparation time. On June 28th of June, the SS Tiger companies were alerted for movement. Road marches began under cover of darkness, the massive tanks grinding along the dirt roads toward Olsztyny, their wide combat tracks chewing deep gouges in the soft earth. By the 4th of July, the companies were nestled in their forward assembly areas, hulls hidden beneath camouflage nets and freshly cut branches, their crews studying aerial photographs of the Soviet defensive belts that awaited them. The operational reports for that day were grimly consistent. Of the 14 Tigers in the 13th Heavy Company of the Leibstandarte, 12 were combat-ready. 2 had already broken down during the approach march. Operation Citadel erupted at 0400 hours on the 5th of July 1943, not with the roar of tank engines, but with a cataclysmic artillery barrage that lit the pre-dawn sky from horizon to horizon. For 90 minutes, thousands of German guns pounded the Soviet defensive belts north and south of the Kursk salient, the concussions rattling the hulls of the waiting Tigers. When the bombardment lifted, the tank regiments moved forward, and the heaviest armored vehicle yet to see combat rolled directly into the most heavily fortified defensive network the Red Army had ever constructed. The Tigers of the Großdeutschland Division advanced from their jump-off positions near Moschenoye, the track links of 15 tanks clattering as they crossed the line of departure. Within minutes of the start line, the lead vehicles ground to a halt. Soviet minefields, sown in belts hundreds of meters deep, lay concealed beneath the tall grass. Engineers scrambled forward with mine detectors, probing the ground ahead of the lead tanks while Soviet artillery fire began to fall. The column inched forward, Tigers immobilized with shattered road wheels, crews swarming over the damage with hammers and replacement track pins, while high-explosive shells burst overhead. By 0530 hours, the first mine barrier had been breached, and the Tigers pushed toward the Gazovka Creek east of Beresovy. Soviet anti-tank gun belts, dug deeply into the reverse slopes of hills, opened fire at ranges of less than a kilometer. The 76.2mm rounds struck the frontal armor of the Tigers and shattered, the impacts ringing the hull like sledgehammers, but failing to penetrate. The Tiger gunners, their cheeks pressed against their optics, traversed their turrets with electric motors and fired. One by one, the anti-tank guns were destroyed, their breeches ripped apart by high-explosive rounds, their crews cut down by coaxial machine gun fire. On the right flank of the advance, SS Obersturmführer Schütz led the Tigers of the Leibstandarte's 13th Heavy Company against Hill 220.5. The Soviet defenders had constructed bunkers of reinforced concrete, their embrasures camouflaged by shrubbery. One of the Tigers took a direct hit to the mantlet from a concealed 76.2mm field gun. The projectile failed to penetrate, but jammed the gun's elevating mechanism. The tank backed away, its driver grinding the gears as he sought cover in a fold of ground, while the company commander's vehicle swung its 88 to return fire. The bunker vanished in a gout of earth and smoke. Farther to the south, the Tigers of the Totenkopf Division were advancing toward Beresov, their turret sides marked with the triple vertical bars that served as the division's temporary insignia for the offensive. The terrain was a nightmarish tangle of ravines, streams, and dense patches of forest, perfect ambush country for Soviet infantry carrying the new 14.5mm anti-tank rifles. These rifles could not penetrate the Tiger's armor, but their hardened steel core rounds could shatter the crystalline vision blocks, blind the driver, or shear off the commander's cupola if they found a seam. 5 Tigers were immobilized by mine damage on this first day alone, their crews laboring under fire to replace road wheels, while their comrades pushed forward. By mid-afternoon, the Großdeutschland Tigers had captured Hill 225.9, overlooking the main road to Bielgorod. Crews unbuttoned their hatches to gulp the hot, cordite-tainted air. The tanks had advanced only a few kilometers, but each meter had been contested. The Soviet defensive doctrine was becoming grimly apparent. Absorb the German armored thrust with deeply echeloned anti-tank gun belts and dense minefields. Then counterattack with massed tank reserves once the panzers were dislocated and separated from their infantry. The Tigers had crushed dozens of anti-tank guns and knocked out scores of T-34s on this first day. But the Soviet defensive belts stretched back 40 kilometers. The fighting on the 6th of July descended into a brutal grind of close-range engagements around the villages of Jukovlevo and Luchki. The Tigers of the Das Reich Division, their turret sides marked with the white outlined letter S and two-digit numerals, pushed toward Hill 243.2 east of Jukovlevo. The division's armored group commander, who had been a battalion commander in the winter battles, directed the tanks with a practiced hand. But the Soviet resistance was ferocious. An armored train, its cars armored with steel plate and mounting 76.2mm guns, emerged from a railway cut and engaged the Tigers at point-blank range. The 88s of the Das Reich tanks traversed toward the new threat, their first round sparking off the train's locomotive. The second volley punctured the boiler, and the armored train erupted in a cloud of steam and smoke, its ammunition cars detonating in a chain reaction that lit the evening sky. In the sector of the Leibstandarte, the fighting around Teterivino on the 8th of July would produce one of the most extraordinary single-tank actions of the entire war. The position near point 239.6 had been stabilized by the Tigers, but a Soviet mechanized brigade, its T-34s refueled and rearmed, surged forward in a counterattack that threatened to sever the thin German line. The Tigers that had been holding the position were withdrawing to resupply, their ammunition racks nearly empty after 2 days of continuous combat. Only one tank remained in the village, Tiger 1322, commanded by SS Unterscharführer Franz Staudiger. Staudiger was a young, non-commissioned officer, a product of the SS training system, who had fought through the winter battles and survived. His tank was already battle-scarred, its turret side scored by multiple hits from 45mm anti-tank guns that had failed to penetrate. As the Soviet T-34s approached Teterino, Staudiger's driver maneuvered the Tiger into a hull-down position behind a low stone wall at the edge of the village. The gunner, a man whose name would not appear in the propaganda reports, traversed the turret toward the lead Soviet tanks, which were advancing in a loose column, their commanders apparently unaware that any German armor remained in the sector. The first shot from the 88mm cannon struck the lead T-34 at 800 meters, the armor-piercing capped round punching through the glacis plate and detonating the ammunition stowed in the hull. The tank erupted, its turret spinning off the hull and landing in the road. The second T-34 swerved to avoid the wreckage, exposing its flank, and Staudiger's gunner put another round through the engine compartment. The third tank attempted to reverse, but the 88 found it at 900 meters, the round passing through the turret and killing the entire crew instantly. The Soviet formation scattered, its tanks seeking cover in the folds of the terrain. But Staudiger's gunner was methodical. One after another, the T-34s were engaged and destroyed. The Tiger's ammunition racks were being depleted rapidly, the loader slamming the heavy rounds into the breech as fast as his arms could move. At one point, Staudiger reported that he was running low on armor-piercing ammunition and would soon be forced to withdraw. But the Soviet tanks, their commanders apparently unable to locate the source of the fire, continued to mill in confusion, and the gunner continued to fire. When the engagement finally ended, 22 T-34s lay destroyed around Teterino. The Soviet brigade, its cohesion shattered, withdrew in disorder, its survivors fleeing back toward their own lines. Staudiger's Tiger, its gun barrel hot enough to cook the paint from its surface, rolled back from the stone wall and limped toward the rear on nearly empty ammunition racks. The action had single-handedly stabilized the front, preventing a Soviet breakthrough that could have unhinged the entire German flank. 2 days later, Franz Staudiger was awarded the Knight's Cross, one of the first Tiger commanders to receive the decoration for a single action. His tank, Tiger 1322, had proven beyond any doubt that a well-handled Tiger could dominate an entire battlefield. The success at Teterino could not mask the grim reality of the broader offensive. By the 11th of July, the German spearheads had advanced deep into the Soviet defensive belts, but the cost in machines was mounting alarmingly. The mechanical frailty that had plagued the Tigers during the winter battles had not been resolved by the spring rebuilds. Transmissions failed under the strain of cross-country movement through thick mud. Final drive housings, their cast iron cases cracking under the 40-ton weight of the vehicles, seized and locked the drive sprockets. Tanks broke down far from any maintenance platoon, their crews forced to abandon them or risk destruction by Soviet infantry squads that were infiltrating through the ruptured lines. On the morning of the 12th of July, the entire character of Operation Citadel changed. The Soviet High Command, which had been husbanding its strategic reserves for precisely this moment, unleashed the 5th Guards Tank Army against the flank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, near the small railway station of Prokhorovka. More than 800 Soviet tanks, their engines roaring at maximum revolutions, surged forward across the open steppe, closing the range as rapidly as possible to negate the German advantage in long-range gunnery. What followed was the largest single-day tank engagement in human history. The Tiger companies of the SS Leibstandarte, their hulls still bore the camouflage patterns applied in the rest camps near Kharkov, were positioned northeast of the Oktyabrski collective farm when the first waves of T-34s appeared on the horizon. The Soviet tanks were advancing at high speed, their commanders aiming to close the range to under 1,000 meters, where their 76.2mm guns might have some chance against the Tiger's frontal armor. The Tiger gunners, their optics adjusted for the rising sun, began to fire at ranges of over 2,000 meters, their 88mm rounds arcing across the steppe and plunging down onto the Soviet formation. Kling, his tank positioned on a low rise that gave him a commanding view of the battlefield, directed his company's fire with the practiced calm of a veteran. His Tigers were spaced at intervals of roughly 100 meters, each covering a sector of the advance. From his position, he could see Wendorf's platoon on the left flank, their gun barrels recoiling as they fired, the empty shell casings ejecting from the breaches and clattering onto the turret floors. The Soviet tanks continued to advance, their numbers so great that they seemed to absorb the German fire without diminishing. Burning T-34s littered the steppe, their crews scrambling from the hatches, but fresh tanks simply bypassed the wrecks and continued on. The 9th Heavy Company of the Totenkopf Division, its commander SS Obersturmführer Schroeder already dead, killed on 8 July near Gresnoye while firing a submachine gun from his open cupola, was now led by a succession of acting officers, each killed or wounded in turn. By evening, the company first sergeant, a senior non-commissioned officer with no formal command training, was directing the remaining tanks. The fighting was so chaotic that precise kill claims became meaningless. All that mattered was survival. The tank battle at Prokhorovka has been mythologized in Soviet historiography as a decisive victory, with Red Army propagandists claiming the destruction of more than 70 Tigers in a single day. The reality, as recorded in the unit war diaries that survived the war, was far different. The combined Tiger strength of the 3 SS divisions on the morning of the 12th of July was exactly 43 tanks. By nightfall, the Heavy Company of the Leibstandarte had suffered 1 total loss. The other companies had lost none. The Tiger formation had absorbed everything the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army could throw at it and remained intact. The Soviet losses, by contrast, were catastrophic. More than 400 tanks were destroyed in a single day. Yet the statistic that ultimately mattered was not the kill ratio, but the strategic balance. The Soviet Union could absorb the loss of 400 tanks. Its factories beyond the Urals were producing replacements far faster than the Germans could destroy them. The German forces could not. Operation Citadel had been designed to pinch off the Kursk salient in a classic pincer movement. But the northern pincer had stalled after only a few kilometers, and the southern pincer, despite the tactical successes of the SS Tigers, had been bled white. On the 13th of July, Hitler ordered the offensive suspended. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had passed irrevocably to the Red Army. The Tigers did not pause to mourn the failure. Even as the citadel crumbled, new crises erupted elsewhere along the front. On the Mias River line, a Soviet offensive had broken through the German defenses, threatening the flank of the entire army group. The SS Tiger companies, their ammunition racks still depleted from the Kursk battles, were entrained at Barwenkowo and rushed south. They detrained on the 28th of July and were in combat the next morning, attacking a heavily fortified hill designated 213.9. Hill 213.9 was a nightmare. A Soviet anti-tank brigade had converted every fold of ground into a killing zone. Minefields sown months in advance channeled the German tanks into pre-registered fire lanes. Anti-tank guns of various calibers, dug into concrete emplacements, fired from multiple angles. The Totenkopf's 9th Heavy Company, reinforced with 8 Tigers recently transferred from the departing Leibstandarte Company, attacked the hill repeatedly over 2 days. 7 Tigers were knocked out or immobilized. The attack finally succeeded on the evening of the 31st, but the cost had been savage. 2 of the tanks, hopelessly trapped in the minefields, were blown up by German engineers to prevent their capture. The hill was taken, the breach in the front was sealed, and Citadel was officially declared terminated. The Tigers had preserved the front, but the strategic situation continued to deteriorate. By the 3rd of August, the operational readiness of the SS Tiger companies was collapsing. The 8th Heavy Company of the Das Reich Division reported only 3 tanks combat-ready. The Totenkopf Company had run through its acting commanders and was being led by senior sergeants. The constant movement from one crisis to another, the endless road marches on tracks that wore down their rubber road wheel rims, the transmissions that seized without warning, the fuel shortages that forced crews to abandon their vehicles and walk, all of it was taking a toll that the orderly replacement system could not match. 22 Tigers remained on the property books of the Totenkopf Company, an overstrength organization created by absorbing the departing Leibstandarte tanks, but the number of tanks capable of actually fighting was far lower. On the 23rd of August 1943, the city of Kharkov was abandoned by German forces for the final time. The Tiger companies, which had fought to capture it in February and had rested in its suburbs in April, fought their last rearguard actions on its outskirts and then turned west. Tanks that could not be evacuated, their transmissions seized or their engines dead, were blown up by their crews with demolition charges placed in the fighting compartments. The summer that had begun with such high hopes, with the promise of a decisive blow that would restore German initiative on the Eastern Front, ended in a desolate retreat through the autumn mud. When the Tiger companies paused in their new assembly areas to count their losses, the tally was stark. The 13th Heavy Company of the SS Leibstandarte, which had entered the summer with 14 tanks fresh from the factories, had transferred its 8 surviving Tigers to the Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions on 26 July before its own personnel left for Italy, leaving only a handful of damaged vehicles to be abandoned during the retreat. The promise of the Tiger, the weapon that could not be stopped, had been tested to destruction, and while it had not been found wanting in combat, it could not be in enough places at once, and the enemy it faced could always replace what it had lost. The mailed fist of the German panzer forces had struck with terrible force, but the body it had struck was simply too vast to break. The survivors of the summer slaughter moved not into rest camps, but into a grinding autumn of unceasing defensive battles. By the first week of September, the 13th Heavy Company of the SS Leibstandarte counted its remaining Tigers on one hand. The other 9 had been lost to Soviet anti-tank guns, crippling mechanical breakdowns, or the mute pyres of self-destruction lit by their own crews. The veterans who had smashed through the Kursk minefields now fought in reverse. Their turrets traversed to 6 o'clock, covering the long retreat from the Dnieper. SS Obersturmführer Wittmann, his face still raw from the summer sun, and the cordite haze of Prokhorovka, moved through the mud of the Radomyshl sector, in a tank he had not started the war in. The original Tigers of his platoon were long gone, burned, blown, or stripped for parts. But the new replacements arrived at a trickle, each one handed over to a crew that had walked out of a wreck and was expected to fight again the same day. The company's war diary, a terse document kept by a harried clerk, logged the stark arithmetic of attrition. On the 15th of November, 18 Tigers were operational near Brusilov. By the evening, 2 had been knocked out by Soviet tanks near Lutchin, and another commander, the veteran Hartel, was dead, his cupola sheared off by a clean hit. To the south, near the river Teterev, Wendorf's platoon fought a series of running engagements that bled the company of its last reserves. His gunner, a former Luftwaffe airman whose hands had once adjusted bomb sights and now traversed an 88mm gun, methodically destroyed 11 T-34s in a single day near Chubarovka. The Tigers moved from one crisis point to the next, their engines never fully cooling, their crews sleeping in shifts inside the fighting compartment, because to leave the tank in the open was to die. It was in this brutal calcination that the aces reached their numerical apogee. Wittmann, by late December, had surpassed 100 confirmed kills. His gunner, the unassuming SS Rottenführer Wohl, had been awarded the Knight's Cross for 80 of his own, and Wendorf, acting as company commander while Kling was absent, had accumulated nearly 90. The 13th Heavy Company alone had destroyed over 340 enemy tanks and 255 anti-tank guns. But the men who tallied those numbers now carried a hollow exhaustion. Each kill required a round. Each round required a functioning gun tube, and each gun tube ultimately wore smooth or shattered under the strain. By Christmas Eve of 1943, the company was down to 13 tanks, and 4 of those had to be abandoned and destroyed east of Chapowitsky during the chaotic withdrawal. On the 27th of December, as Wendorf's platoon engaged a Soviet breakthrough near Antopol-Boyarka. The calculus of tank warfare revealed its utter cruelty. Wendorf destroyed 11 T-34s in a single rolling engagement, but one of his own Tigers, commanded by a veteran named Sadzio, was hit and consumed. The crew did not bail out. The following day, 2 more disabled Tigers were blown up by their own engineers to prevent capture, their hulls still warm from the recent fighting. The company, which had started November with 27 tanks, entered the new year with 9. On the 14th of January, in a frozen village whose name the clerks later simplified to Chotorisco, Whitman received the Knight's Cross. The presentation was brief. The division commander, SS Oberfuhrer Wisch, pinned the award on his collar in the shadow of a battered Tiger, its camouflage paint scarred by shell splinters and small arms fire. Whitman's tally stood at 88 kills, and the propaganda apparatus would soon make him the face of the armored corps. But the men around him understood the truth. The Knight's Cross was not a celebration of victory, but a recognition that the war had become a battle of survival against a foe whose material resources were bottomless. The month of January consumed the remaining Tigers of the Leibstandarte with an appetite that shocked even the veterans. In the first week alone, 5 tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent them from falling into the advancing Soviet spearheads. Whitman's gunner scored kill after kill, but each engagement pushed the worn-out tanks closer to mechanical collapse. By the middle of the month, Wendorf had been promoted to SS Obersturmführer, and Kling, the cold professional company commander, was given command of the entire 2nd Battalion of the SS Panzer Regiment. The original cadre, the men who had trained at Fallingbostel, were now leading battalions, not platoons, not because the army had expanded, but because so many of their comrades were dead. Far to the south, in a theatre separated from the Russian steppes by the entire spine of the Alps, another Tiger company was fighting its own desperate war. The Heavy Company Meyer had been formed in July of 1943. A scratch unit of 8 Tigers rushed to Italy to meet the Allied invasion of Sicily. By the time it reached the Italian mainland, the front had shifted north, and the company found itself conducting route reconnaissance and preparing firing positions for a contingency that the commanders in Rome refused to believe would occur. Its commander was a young officer named Meyer, a native of the Baltic coast whose tanks bore unique markings, a black Baltic cross on the front hull plate rather than the standard Balkenkreuz, and names painted by the crews themselves: Mausi, Strolch, and the exotically titled Tiger von Eschnapur. The designated commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Schwebbach, had only recently arrived when, at 3 in the morning of the 22nd of January, the Allies began landing at the Unzio Nettuno beachhead. The pre-planned German counterattack, a swift armored strike into the heart of the landing zone, was inexplicably abandoned without a coherent reason given. The Tigers, fully fueled and positioned in the olive groves near Pavona, remained idle for 4 crucial days. The attack that finally came on the 26th was a rushed, poorly reconnoitred affair. Schwebbach led from the front in Tiger II, a vehicle his crew had painted with the name Mausi. Near Aprilia, advancing under naval gunfire and the crossfire of dug-in Allied anti-tank guns, a round struck the commander's cupola with surgical precision and killed him instantly. The attack stalled immediately. The other Tigers, lacking a designated commander and facing the concentrated firepower of the beachhead's defensive ring, pulled back under the cover of a smokescreen. The beachhead remained. In the weeks that followed, the company fought a series of disjointed engagements near Cisterna and the ill-fated Fingerwoods, losing Tigers to mines, mechanical failures, and the sheer unsuitability of heavy tanks in the marshy, canal-laced terrain. By early February, the Meyer Company was consolidated into Schwerpanzerabteilung 508. Its independent existence dissolved into the larger formation. The survivors of the unit, which had started its journey at the Brenner Pass only 6 months earlier, became one more entry in the growing ledger of units absorbed, renamed, and ultimately destroyed by the war's insatiable appetite. To the east, on the rolling plains of northern Romania, the Grossdeutschland Tiger Battalion was undergoing its own calculus of attrition. The once elite unit, now a full battalion of 45 Tigers, had been fighting without pause since the summer, its tanks wearing out faster than they could be repaired. On the 18th of October, near Taranzov, and Oberfeldwebel named Rampel, a veteran whose tank was already damaged and not fully operational, was ordered to hold a sector against a massive Soviet armor thrust. He destroyed 17 of the approximately 40 attacking T-34s before his own vehicle, battered by multiple hits, finally limped back to the maintenance company under its own power. Rampal would later be posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross, for he did not survive the war. But his action crystallized the brutal paradox of the Tiger on the Eastern Front in 1943 and 1944. A single tank, properly handled, could inflict devastating losses on a Soviet armored brigade. But the numerical superiority of the Red Army meant that the unit as a whole was being slowly bled to death. By early March of 1944, near the town of Targul Frumos, the Großdeutschland Tigers were down to 10 operational vehicles, with scores awaiting parts or cannibalization. The battle for Targul Frumos, which raged across the muddy hills in April, demonstrated both the tactical supremacy of the Tiger and its strategic irrelevance. The Großdeutschland Battalion, fighting from prepared reverse-slope positions, repelled multiple Soviet armored assaults, destroying over 50 tanks, including the new Joseph Stalin, heavy tanks whose 122mm rounds were among the few that could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. Bock, still a company commander at this point, led counterattacks that shattered Soviet spearheads, but each victory cost the battalion tanks it could not replace. 2 brand new Tigers were handed over to the neighboring Totenkopf formation to keep their heavy company operational. Another 4 were transferred from deliveries intended for the Army's own depot-level maintenance stocks. The human cost mounted in parallel with the material one. The maintenance company, which should have been a rear area unit, was constantly under fire, its cranes and recovery vehicles frequently targeted by Soviet artillery observers. Crews who lost their tanks, and the battalion lost over 30 between March and May, were routinely dismounted and thrown into the line as ersatz infantry. Among them were men who had been with the unit since its formation at Sennelager, now clutching rifles and Panzerfaust in the muddy trenches around Jassy. Their specialized training in the Tiger's complex systems rendered irrelevant by the simple fact that there were no tanks left for them to crew. The Tiger War had entered its terminal phase not on the battlefield, but in the ledgers and the logistics tables. The factories at Kassel and Wegmann produced tanks at a steady pace, but the transport system that delivered them was under constant attack, and the fuel that fed their engines was dwindling. Each Tiger that burned was a loss that could not be replaced within the combat timeframe. Each veteran crew that died took with it the accumulated experience of months of fighting that no replacement, however enthusiastic, could replicate in the brief time remaining. By the 30th of April, as the spring rains turned the Romanian plains into a quagmire that halted even tracked movement, Wittmann was in Germany, his Knight's Cross already awarded in January for his 117th kill. Kling commanded the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandartes Panzer Regiment. Wendorf was dead. He would not be killed until August, but his fate was already etched into the war's trajectory. The Großdeutschland Tigers, their ranks thinned by combat and neglect, continued to fight a series of desperate defensive actions that would culminate, in the months ahead, in a battle whose scale and ferocity dwarfed even the slaughter at Kursk. In the west, where the Allied armies were massing for an invasion that would open a second front, a new generation of Tiger crews was training on the latest variant of the heavy tank. The Tiger II, with its sloping armor and its longer, more powerful 88mm gun. Men like Hartranft, who had not yet fired a shot in anger, were drilling on the Sennelager ranges, unaware that the war they were about to enter would be a war of annihilation from which the Tiger would not emerge. The Tiger companies had proven, in 18 months of continuous combat, that they could achieve local tactical dominance wherever they were committed. But the stream of replacements of tanks, of crews, of fuel, was a trickle compared to the torrent flowing from the factories of the Urals and the ports of the United States. The aces, the oak leaves, the kill rings painted on gun barrels, all of it was a monument to an era that was already closing. The Tigers were still the most feared vehicles on the battlefield, but the battlefield itself was shrinking, collapsing inward toward the borders of the Reich. And, in a quiet room in the Führer headquarters, Wittmann accepted the swords to the Knight's Cross. The weight of the award a tangible reminder that the war's most celebrated tank ace was now a marked man, a symbol whose legend would soon collide with the terrible reality of the Bocage country in Normandy. The ceremony was a carefully orchestrated piece of propaganda, but it pulled Germany's most famous tank ace away from his unit at the precise moment the Western Allies were massing for an invasion that would open a second front. While Wittmann stood for photographs in the Great Hall, his comrades on the Eastern Front continued the grinding work of survival. Their Tiger companies bled white by months of unceasing defensive battles. Far to the west, in the training fields around Sennelager, a new commander was drilling his men on an even more formidable machine. This was Kurt Hartramf, a newly minted SS Sturmbannführer who had spent the previous 3 years in staff and training roles, never yet firing a shot in anger from a Tiger. Now he stood before the first production models of the Tiger II, the monstrous King Tiger with its sloped armor and long 88mm Kdu-UK-43, instructing crews who had never seen combat on the intricate rituals of loading, traversing, and firing the heaviest tank in the German arsenal. On the 1st of May, the Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 101 reported 38 of its 45 Tiger is operational, a state of readiness that would not survive the coming weeks. SS Obersturmbannführer von Westenhagen, the battalion commander, had drilled his men relentlessly in the rolling countryside east of Amiens, but no amount of training could prepare them for what waited across the Channel. The battalion was a curious hybrid now. The old veterans from the Eastern Front mixed with fresh recruits, the surviving tanks a collection of worn-out machines patched together with cannibalized parts from earlier losses. In Romania, Hauptmann Bock of the Großdeutschland Tiger Battalion faced a different sort of war. His command was fighting a desperate series of defensive actions, repelling massed Soviet armor attacks, while itself suffering heavy losses to mechanical failures, and the relentless pressure of the Red Army's advance. Bock would not see Normandy. His war was the grinding, unforgiving Eastern Front, where the calculus of attrition was measured in burned-out tanks and dismounted crews used as infantry. At dawn on the 7th of June, the first elements of Schwere SS Panzerabteilung 101 began their road march toward the invasion beaches, threading through the narrow lanes of northern France under skies dominated by Allied fighter bombers. The second company, commanded by Wittmann, moved via Argentan toward Falaise, while the first company took a more southerly route toward Caen, both columns suffering strafing attacks that forced them to move only at night. By the 12th of June, Wittmann had assembled 6 operational Tigers in a defile south of Montbrococ, just northeast of a small Norman town called Villers-Bocage, and the entire British 7th Armoured Division was moving toward him. On the morning of the 13th, a detachment of the 22nd Armoured Brigade halted at point 213, a low rise overlooking the Caen Road, and began brewing tea. Wittmann, observing the column from a concealed position, saw not a deployed combat formation, but a snake of parked tanks, half-tracks, and carriers, their crews dismounted and unsuspecting. He made a decision that would become legend. Rather than wait for his company to assemble, he would attack alone with his single Tiger, plunging into the flank of one of Britain's most celebrated armoured formations. Wittmann's Tiger, number 222, roared out of the tree line and struck the rear of a squadron first, knocking out a Cromwell and a Firefly that had nearly reached point 213. Then he drove parallel to the road. His gunner methodically engaged each vehicle in the column. They destroyed 13 M3 half-tracks, 3 Stuart light tanks, 2 Sherman observation tanks, the brigade intelligence officer's Daimler scout car, and more than a dozen Bren and Lloyd carriers. The destruction took perhaps 15 minutes, the precise, unhurried work of an expert gunner and a commander who understood that the column had no room to maneuver and no way to escape. At the outskirts of Villers-Bocage, Wittmann knocked out 3 of the 4 Cromwells of the regimental headquarters, then entered the town alone, pursued by the surviving Cromwell whose commander, desperate and brave, fired 2 armor-piercing rounds at a range of only 50 meters. Both rounds shattered on the Tiger's rear armor, and Wittmann's gunner traversed the turret and destroyed the Cromwell with a single shot, then pushed deeper into the narrow streets until a Firefly, hidden behind a corner, fired into his flank and immobilized the Tiger by shredding the left drive sprocket. Wittmann and his crew bailed out, made their way on foot to the command post of the Panzer-Lehr Division, and that afternoon the remaining Tigers of the 2nd Company, joined by 8 tanks of the 1st Company, attacked Villers-Bocage from the east. By nightfall, the British had lost 26 tanks, 14 M3s, 8 Bren carriers and 8 Lloyd carriers, and the advance of the 7th Armoured Division had been completely halted. Wittmann was recommended for the Swords to the Knight's Cross, his fame now sealed not by a decade of service, but by 15 minutes of audacious, technically flawless violence. The British would later claim the engagement as a tactical setback. But the truth was simpler. One man in one tank had stopped an entire division, and the shock of that fact would ripple through Allied command for weeks. The cost to the battalion was immediate and severe. 3 Tigers of the 1st Company destroyed inside the town, including the tank of SS Oberscharführer Ernst, knocked out by a Firefly, firing through two corner windows, and the tank of SS Obersturmführer Lucasius, hit from the rear by another Firefly. That same night, the third company reached Falaise, its tanks still mechanically sound, but its crews already nursing the particular dread of men who had heard about the carnage ahead. 2 days later, the third company was hit by a heavy air strike near Evresis, and the result was catastrophic. Almost all the Tigers were knocked out, 2 burned completely, 1 tumbled into a defile killing the crew, and the company commander's tank had its turret blown off. 18 men were dead, 11 wounded, and among the civilian population of the nearby village, 138 lay buried in the rubble of their homes. In the east, on the dusty plains of Romania, the Großdeutschland Tigers were fighting their own desolate battles. On the 2nd of May, north of Targul Frumos, Box Company repulsed a series of massed Soviet armor assaults, the Tiger gunners engaging Joseph Stalin heavy tanks at long range, destroying over 50 enemy vehicles, while themselves suffering losses they could barely replace. The tanks that limped back to the maintenance depot were scarred with deep gouges, where Soviet 122mm rounds had failed to penetrate, but each impact had stressed welds, cracked armor plates, and shaken loose components that no field workshop could properly repair. By the 1st of July, the operational strength of Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101 had collapsed to just 11 Tigers, scattered along a corps front that was buckling under the weight of relentless British pressure. The first company handed over its last 3 tanks to the third company and entrained for Paderborn, where it would be re-equipped with the new Tiger II, leaving the remnants behind to fight on with whatever they had left. On the 11th of July, the battle for Hill 112 reached its crescendo. The second company of Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 102, newly arrived from the Netherlands, attacked north from St. Martin toward Moltot, engaging the 7th Royal Tank Regiment in the close country south of the hill that the British were already calling Calvary. In the dense bocage, with its sunken lanes and high hedgerows, the Tigers could not use their long-range advantage, and the British Fireflies, armed with the 17-pounder gun, proved lethally effective at the short ranges that the terrain imposed. The Tigers of Hartrump's battalion knocked out 3 enemy tanks and an anti-tank gun, but the company commander, SS Hauptsturmführer Endermann, took a route too far to the right into high brush, and he was never seen again. The third company lost 3 tanks in rapid succession. S. Untersturmführer Stroy killed when his tank was hit and consumed SS Unterscharführer Richter, losing an arm in the bailing out, and a third commander taken prisoner. Among the tank commanders of the 102nd, one man was already distinguishing himself with a quiet, unassuming competence that would make him the battalion's top scorer. His name was Paul Egger, an SS Oberscharführer, who had transferred into the battalion during its training in the Netherlands. And in the fighting around Hill 112, he began accumulating the kill tally that would eventually reach 113 before the war was over. Egger fought with a methodical precision that stood in stark contrast to the chaos around him. His gunner destroying British tanks one after another while the Tiger's thick frontal armor absorbed hits that would have gutted a lesser vehicle. In the 101st, another young tank commander was making his mark. SS Rottenführer Bobby Warmbrunn, one of the youngest aces in the battalion, had been knocking out British tanks near Schur since late June, racking up kills with a casual efficiency that belied his age. On the 21st of June, his Tiger was knocked out by an anti-tank gun, but Warmbrunn survived, and by early July he was back in a new tank, continuing the grim work of destruction that was consuming his youth. The 8th of August dawned hot and clear, the kind of day that fighter bombers loved. Operation Totalize had begun the night before, a massive Canadian thrust south from Caen, designed to break through the German lines and seal the Falaise Gap, and Whitman, now acting battalion commander, received orders to block the advance with a scratch force of 7 Tigers. He led the column north along the N158, past Gomersnil, past the charred wrecks of earlier battles, and directly into an ambush laid by a squadron of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, hidden in a tree line to the east. The first shots from the Fireflies knocked out the lead and trail Tigers, trapping Whitman's tank, number 007, in the killing zone, and before he could react, his Tiger was hit multiple times, the armor-piercing rounds punching through the thinner side protection and igniting the ammunition stored in the hull. The turret blew off, the hull erupted in flame, and Whitman and his crew were killed instantly, their Tiger becoming a funeral pyre visible for miles across the Norman plain. 5 other Tigers were destroyed in the same engagement, all by a single Firefly that fired from the flank with devastating accuracy. The Black Baron was dead, the myth shattered, and among the survivors of the battalion, the shock was as profound as it was silent. Whitman had been the symbol of their invincibility, and now his burned-out tank sat in a field near Gomesnil, a mute testament to the end of an era. 6 days later, Helmut Wendorf met his own end. He was leading 2 Tigers from Assy to Mézières to support the 85th Infantry Division, when he was surprised by 2 Shermans emerging from a patch of. Wendorf knocked out one of them, but the other fired at close range, and the round penetrated the Tiger's flank, igniting the engine compartment and setting the tank on fire. Wendorf and his loader were killed. The radio operator, a man named Zimmermann, trapped inside the burning hull, shot himself rather than burn alive. Wendorf, who had been promoted to SS Obersturmführer just 7 months earlier, who had been awarded the Knight's Cross in February for his 95 kills, died in a Norman orchard with the smell of cordite and burning rubber in his nostrils. By the 20th of August, the Falaise pocket had become a slaughterhouse. The roads south were clogged with burning vehicles, and the few Tigers that remained operational were out of fuel, their crews loading the last rounds of ammunition and preparing to destroy their own tanks rather than surrender them. Hartranft's battalion, the 102nd, had been reduced to a single operational Tiger, which was abandoned near Genval after its crew disabled the main gun with an explosive charge and melted into the chaos of the retreat. Of the 45 Tigers that had entered Normandy with the 2 SS battalions, only a handful crossed the Seine, ferried over on barges or forded with the deep wading equipment that had been designed for an invasion of England that never came. The survivors assembled west of Amiens, dazed, exhausted, and utterly depleted, their war diaries recording losses that defied comprehension. 300 killed and missing from the 101st alone, including every officer above the rank of SS Obersturmführer. The Tiger War in Normandy was over. The aces were dead, the battalions shattered, and the tanks that had once dominated the battlefields of Russia lay scattered across the bocage, their hulls rusting in the rain, their wreckage a tourist attraction for advancing Allied soldiers who posed for photographs beside the hulks of the monsters that had terrorized them for 2 months. The autumn rains of 1944 swept across the Sennelager training fields, churning the ground into a familiar brown morass that swallowed the combat tracks of the Tiger II tanks, now being hurriedly issued to the reconstituted battalions. The survivors of Normandy, the men of the 101st and 102nd Heavy SS Panzer battalions, those who had crawled from burning hulls and waded the Seine under fire, assembled around these new machines with a hardened, hollow stare. The Tiger II was a brute, a 70-ton monster with a longer 88mm KWK-43 cannon and sloped frontal armor that theoretically rendered it invulnerable to almost any Allied gun at standard combat ranges. But the men knew its secrets, its frail final drives, its overworked Maybach engine, and the logistical nightmare of fueling a vehicle that consumed a liter of gasoline for every 100 meters of marching. SS Obersturmbannführer von Westenhagen, the gaunt battalion commander who had led the unit since its formation, walked among the new tanks with the weary understanding that this weapon, for all its brutal grandeur, would not change the war. On the 2nd of December, the 501st began in training at Gütersloh and Brequide, its 45 Tiger Ayers loaded onto flat cars for a journey west into the Ardennes forest. 13 days later, during the night of the 15th, the column moved into assembly areas on both sides of the road between Singsheim and Engelgau. The crews kept in the dark about their objective until the final briefing in the regimental command post. They were to spearhead Kampfgruppe Piper, the mailed fist of the 6th Panzer Army, breaking through the thin American lines and crossing the Meuse River before racing for Antwerp. At 05:30 on the 16th, the artillery thundered, and the Tigers of the 501st rumbled forward over the R421, their massive hulls scraping the pine boughs as they moved into history. The advance bogged down almost immediately. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes, designed for farm carts, not 70-ton armored vehicles, became death traps of mud and ice, and the lead Tigers, swinging wide to avoid bends, were forced to halt again and again by traffic jams extending back for miles. By the 18th, the spearhead had reached Stavelot, where the crossing over the Amblève River became a choke point, and the company commander of the 1st Company, his tank hit by American anti-tank fire from the 526th Infantry, was forced to reverse through a building, the Tiger becoming jammed in the debris and abandoned. At L'Église, the advance stopped for good. The remaining tanks encircled, low on fuel, and cut off from resupply as the skies cleared and American thunderbolts dove on the column. On the night of the 24th of December, the order was given to destroy the vehicles and break out on foot. Oberscharführer Wendt blew the demolition charges in his Tiger 133, the detonation rupturing the hull and sending a shockwave through the silent, snow-covered village, the sound of a battalion immolating itself rather than surrendering. 6 Tigers of the 1st Company, which had not even reached the front, were later blown up on Schloss Holter's training ground by a rear echelon commander with one leg, the final gesture of a formation that had entered the Ardennes with 45 tanks and emerged with 32 burning wrecks scattered across the Belgian countryside. The survivors of the Ardennes, what remained of the heavy battalions, were hurriedly entrained and transported east in early February 1945, the railway cars puffing through a winter landscape that seemed to shrink the Reich with every kilometre. Their destination was Hungary, where the last major German offensive of the war, Operation Frühlingserwachen, was to thrust toward the oil fields and attempt the relief of the encircled garrison in Budapest. On the 6th of March, the attack clawed forward across ground that was already thawing into a bottomless soup, the 700-horsepower Maybach engines roaring in protest as the 70-ton Tiger IIs churned through greasy clay that pulled at the tracks and clogged the road wheels. Near Lake Balaton, the few operational Tigers of the 501st and the newly committed 503rd Heavy SS Panzer Battalion fought a disintegrating battle against massed Joseph Stalin heavy tanks, their 88mm guns cracking the Soviet armor at ranges the Russian 122mm rounds could not reciprocate. But for every Joseph Stalin knocked out, the Tigers were swamped by a tide of T-34-85s that poured around their flanks, and the soft ground claimed more tanks than enemy fire. By March 20th, the offensive had shattered completely, and the commander of the 501st SS Obersturmbannführer von Westenhagen, worn to a skeletal state by illness and the impossible weight of command, was relieved and summoned to the Corps headquarters at the Oliver Castle near Danzig. Sturmbannführer Heinz Kling, the man who had led the Leibstandarte Tigers since their first winter at Kharkov, took over the remnants of the battalion, absorbing the grim reality that no tactical brilliance could now arrest the collapse. Far to the north, in the shrinking pocket of East Prussia, Hauptmann Bock's Grossdeutschland Tiger Battalion was fighting its own Götterdämmerung. On the 30th of January, leading what remained of the division's armor in a desperate counterattack along the Half Road, Bock and his Tigers smashed into a mass of Soviet armor advancing on Waldburg, destroying 68 tanks in a single day of savage point-blank combat. For this action, Bock was awarded the Knight's Cross, but the cost was the battalion itself, its last tanks abandoned or destroyed, the surviving crews dismounted and flung into the frozen defensive lines as infantry, armed with nothing but Panzerfasts and a burning refusal to surrender. By mid-February, the Grossdeutschland Tiger Battalion had ceased to exist. Its last vehicles either sunk in the Frisch's Haff or stripped for parts on the docks of Pillau. The men who had destroyed over 500 tanks now themselves, hunted through the pine forests by an enemy who offered no quarter. The final act unfolded in the shattered carcass of Berlin, where a handful of Tiger IIs from the 503rd Heavy SS Panzer Battalion had been scattered into the city's defense, fighting as isolated fire brigades in a landscape of rubble and smoke. On April 19th, near Bollersdorf, east of the capital, SS Oberscharführer Karl Körner, a tank commander with a reputation for ice-cold precision, spotted an entire Soviet armored brigade assembling in a careless cluster on a road junction. Joseph Stalin's and T-34-85s crowded together as if on a peacetime exercise. He opened by knocking out the lead and trail Joseph Stalin's with 2 rounds. The column was trapped with 2 other Tigers. He began a methodical slaughter. Gunner and loader worked as a synchronized machine, spent brass clattering to the turret floor. Within minutes, over 100 Soviet tanks blazed as wrecks. Körner's Tiger alone accounted for 39 kills that day, his gunner working the breech with the mechanical rhythm of a factory press, loading and firing until the spent casings cluttered the turret floor ankle deep and the gun tube was too hot to touch. The city shrank around them, the defense compressing into a thin, desperate ring around the government quarter, and by the 26th, The handful of remaining Tigers were holding the Potsdamer Platz against waves of T-34s, advancing through the smoke of burning ministries. An Unterscharführer named Diers, commanding a Tiger whose turret weldings had been hastily patched in a Berlin factory, destroyed 30 T-34s before a hit to the right track immobilized his vehicle. He and his crew abandoned the tank at the entrance to the subway station, the massive hull settling on its broken suspension like a wounded beast, its long 88mm barrel still pointing defiantly east toward the approaching Soviet armies. On the 29th of April, deep beneath the Reichschancellery, SS Brigadeführer Mohnke gathered the last of the Tiger commanders in the flickering candlelight of the Führerbunker's antechamber. His voice was hoarse, his uniform rumpled, and he pinned the Knight's Cross onto the chests of 3 men. Körner, SS Untersturmführer Schäfer, and SS Sturmbannführer Hartranft, the latter awarded in absentia, his battalion already vaporized in the Halby pocket. Hours later, with the Soviet guns now raining shells directly onto the Chancellery roof, the order was given: assemble at the Friedrichstrasse railway station, break out north across the Weidendammer Bridge, and attempt to reach the Elbe. At 2100 on the 1st of May, the column lurched into motion. A grotesque caravan of Tiger Eyes, Panthers, and armored cars, their rear decks loaded with desperate officials, wounded soldiers, and one man whose identity would haunt historians for decades. Martin Bormann, the Reichsleiter and gatekeeper of Hitler's inner circle, clung to the back of a Tiger, his leather coat flapping in the backwash of the engine, the firestorm of the dying city reflecting in his spectacles. As the column turned into the Friedrichstrasse, Soviet infantry and anti-tank guns opened fire from the upper windows of shattered buildings, and a Panzerfaust round, fired from a side street, struck the lead Tiger in the flank, the detonation jolting the massive hull and scattering the passengers on the rear deck like ash from a struck log. The Tiger slewed sideways, blocking the road, and the Soviet shells that followed raked the trapped column. A storm of steel and flame that left Bormann dead in the rubble, his body, and the question of whether he had been killed instantly or made a final futile attempt to flee, lost in the chaos. The last Tigers, now separated and leaderless, attempted their own breakouts, one knocked out by a captured German 88mm flak gun now manned by Soviet crews, another destroyed by its crew after a track jammed on a bridge approach. By the morning of the 2nd of May, with General Weidling's surrender echoing through the remaining pockets of resistance, the Tiger era had ended, terminated not with a climactic armor clash, but in the smoke and silence of a city reduced to ash. The last tank abandoned at the Potsdamer Platz, its engine cold, its hatches open, its crew long since disappeared into the catacombs of a destroyed world. The survivors scattered, some reaching the Elbe and crossing into American captivity, others disappearing into Soviet labor camps from which they would not return for a decade. Michael Wittmann's charred Tiger 007 remained by the Norman Road for months, a silent grave that would later be excavated and reburied with the remains of his crew. Bobby Warmbrun, the boyish ace who had knocked out scores of British tanks in Normandy, did not survive the war either. He was killed in the Falaise pocket, his Tiger engulfed by a Typhoon's rocket strike. Heinz Kling, the stoic veteran who had commanded Tigers at Kharkov, Kursk, and through the forests of the Ardennes, survived the war, fading into the anonymity of a defeated Germany, his war diary recording losses that defied comprehension. Of the nearly 500 Tiger tanks fielded by the SS heavy battalions, fewer than a dozen remained, and those not as fighting vehicles, but as monuments to a hubris that had consumed the men who once believed the Tiger made them invincible. Hauptmann Bock, the man who had held the Half Road and been awarded the Knight's Cross for destroying 68 tanks in a day, also survived. Though the records of his later years are thin, the gaps filled only by silence. Kurt Hartranft, captured in the Halby breakout, spent years in Soviet captivity. The Knight's Cross awarded to him in that candlelit bunker, never reaching his hands until long after the war, a bitter irony for a commander who had fought from Normandy to Berlin. Franz Staudiger, the man who had single-handedly destroyed 22 T-34s at Teterino, lived through the war, his fate after 1945 lost to the chaos of the immediate post-war years. Quiet end for a warrior whose stand had stabilized an entire front. That last Tiger at the Potsdamer Platz, the tank of Unterscharführer Diers, sat for days after the surrender, its guns still pointing east, as if the machine itself refused to acknowledge the armistice. It became a silent monument, not to the regime it had served, but to the men who had climbed inside its steel hull, men who had been forged in a technological terror, who had believed in the armor that surrounded them, and who had discovered in that final cataclysm that no armor, no matter how thick, can shield a soldier from the collapse of the world around him. The Tiger, that 70-ton colossus that had once seemed unbeatable, had been beaten not by any single weapon but by the sheer weight of a war it could never win, and the faces of the last crews, exhausted and hollow, staring east from their open hatches as the Soviet columns rolled into Berlin. The final image of an era that began with a roar at Kharkov and ended in silence at the Potsdamer Platz. The stories of the Tiger crews are part of a larger history that touched millions of families across generations. And if someone in your family served in the armored forces, or if you have a recollection passed down about those final months of the war, we would be honored to hear it in the comments below. Sharing these personal histories helps ensure the human dimension of these events is never lost. And subscribing and liking the video supports our work in bringing these meticulously researched stories to a wider audience.